Hello and welcome to a Word for This Day podcast. I'm Jory Schaefer, the show's host and creator, and it is my joy and pleasure to welcome you today. Welcome to anyone who's found us for the first time. It's no accident that you're here today, friends, so please don't run off quite yet. Please stick around for a bit and let's see what the Lord has for all of us today. And welcome back to you regular listeners. I'm so thankful that you're here, and I love thinking about God's Word with you today, or any day for that matter. I just wish I knew who all of you were. I wish we could sit around and visit, but the Lord doesn't have it this way for us now, and so we'll just keep doing what we're doing and gather in this way, thinking about His Word together. Please know that I continue to pray for you daily, that the Lord would draw you closer to Him and give you more of a desire to know Him and to know His Word, and that you will be very intentional about the time that you spend with Him. Oh, friends, make an appointment to spend time with Him each day. Make several appointments. We must do that. We must do that. It needs to be in our calendars. It needs to be in our mind. We make time for the things that are important to us. And this old world will tell you, oh, you don't have time to do that. You don't have time for that outdated book. You could do your little 30-second or 1-minute read on Instagram or read a little verse here and you're set for the day. No. Push back against that. It takes time to think and focus on Him. We don't want to be those who have these traditions, but our hearts are far from Him. Jesus spoke very clearly about that. His Word tells us how He feels about it. His Word tells us how God feels about it. We don't do what we do, spending time praying or worshiping or reading His Word just to check a box. We do it to know more of Him. And so it all has to do with our heart set, our mindset. And it is not something that comes naturally because our flesh wants to do something different. But the blessings that He gives if you will invest that time, spending time with Him and seeking Him. Please consider sharing this podcast with friends, family, neighbors, strangers, just anyone you think may receive a blessing from it. And know that I truly love to hear from you. So if you feel so led, send me a message sometime. Let me know what the Lord's doing in your life as you're spending more time with Him. Well, our verse for the day for November the 18th, 2024 comes from Numbers chapter 11, verse 18, and it reads as follows from the Legacy Standard Bible. And say to the people, set yourselves apart as holy for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the ears of Yahweh, saying, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, for it was good for us in Egypt. Therefore Yahweh will give you meat, and you shall eat. Oh, friends, this is one of those stories where God gave the people what they asked for. But in doing so, He taught them a lesson. And so we learn much from this. I just can't wait for us to jump in here and see, because it's such a reminder for all of us. As we talked about yesterday, as we've talked about a lot, it matters about our heart. It matters about us honoring God. It matters about us thanking Him for what He has done. He gives us what we need. He gives us what we need when we need it. His timing is perfect. And may we not be, and I have been guilty of this and have had to ask for forgiveness for this, may we not be a whiny child who demands things from a loving Father and doesn't see what He does for us on a second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day basis. He loves us and He takes care of us, and He has done so much for us. So this is just such an important reminder. The other thing that has been so neat for me as I spent time preparing for this podcast was I was reminded, when you slow down and read, it could change what you had thought about a story that you thought you knew in the Bible. And so I still learn things about that every time, and it comes down to slowing down. And so I'm excited to share this with you. You all probably knew it already, but it was such a good reminder to me. So, if you've been on this journey with me for any length of time, this is the time that we think about where we are in the scripture, what was going on, who may have written the book or letter we're in, what's the context, and that will help us to remember it, to share it, and to be able to apply what we learn. And so we are in the Old Testament, we are in the law, and we're in the book of Numbers. So the Old Testament begins with the 5 books of the law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. It then moves to Old Testament history, and then to the wisdom and poetry literature, and then to the major prophets, and then the minor prophets. Those 5 books of the law at the very beginning of the scripture go all the way back to creation, and then it tells us the story of the first people and of when sin entered the world, and it tells us how that sin affected people, and then we hear about how God came in and started over because of the great sin, and because the imagination of every heart was evil at that time, and God sent the great flood, and he started over with Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives, with 8 people. And then within Noah's lineage was Abram, and Abram became Abraham, and this was, hundreds of years down the road. But after Abraham, he had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob. Jacob had his 12 sons. Jacob's other name was Israel, and so we read about the children of Israel, and we read so much about that. And as I've told you over and over again several times these last few months, the things that happened with the children of Israel serve as an example to us so that we may not crave evil as they did. We read that Paul writes that in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6. And so it is very important for us to think about this history. Some people will say, oh, well, since Jesus has come and he's the mediator of the new covenant, we don't need to read about those things in the Old Testament. We don't have to know about that. And I'd say, oh, that's just not true. All scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, correction, reproof, and training in righteousness. And just like we saw yesterday, Jesus quoted just in that one little verse, sections from 2 parts of scripture that were in the Old Testament. If Jesus knew it, and Jesus quoted it, and God has given it to us, then we need to know it and study it. And it gives us just such a greater picture of God and his love for his people, his character, his goodness, his faithfulness, but also, as we're going to see today, his holiness and his righteousness and his justice, and how he disciplines his children, and how we really must be aware of our attitude toward him and the things that we say and the way that we act. And so just such a good example, and I'm excited for us to dig in. Remember, Genesis tells us about those beginnings. Exodus talks about that time when after Abraham's descendants, Isaac's descendants, Jacob's descendants had gone down to Egypt, they grew up from 70 people to over 600,000 men. And so it's thought that there were 2 to 2.5 million people total. And they had become enslaved in Egypt, and they cried out to God, and God sent Moses to lead them out. And so they exited Egypt, and that's what that story is in Exodus. And we read first in Exodus about that law and the covenant, the commandments that God gave his people as they were in the wilderness right at the beginning. And then in Leviticus, we read more about that law, more details, and more about the priesthood that God had set up with his Levites. That's where you get Leviticus. One of the children of Israel was Levi, and his descendants were the Levites. Moses was a Levite. Aaron was a Levite. And so that's where we get about the priesthood. Numbers is the book we're in today, and it has more details about that time that they were in the wilderness. Really focuses on about the first year and a lot on the last year that they're in the wilderness. And then we also see right after Numbers, Deuteronomy, which remember is a series of farewell addresses that Moses had for his people. And he was not going to be able to cross into that promised land. So he had these farewell instructions, and he went back and reminded them of many of the things that had happened and what God had said. And so that gives us a framework. And if you can think about those books of the law in this way, it's very helpful. It's very helpful for us to go back and remember so we can find things when they are brought to mind. Well, as I mentioned, Numbers, which is where we find our verses for the day, I wasn't sure for a long time why they called it Numbers, but when you look in there, it tells us a lot. There are a lot of numberings, a lot of things listed, countings of things. But in some of the earliest Hebrew texts, they name it based on the fifth Hebrew word, which is in the wilderness. And that is a very descriptive term of more of the things that happened while they were wandering. Some will call it, and he spoke, from the first word or the first phrase of this that was in the original Hebrew. But I like to be reminded that it really does talk a lot about what happened during the time that they were in the wilderness. Moses is thought to have written this, as he is the other 4 books of the law, and there's nowhere within Numbers that says, Moses wrote this, but the earliest church history and then even more importantly places in the scripture will say that Moses was the one that wrote the law, and these 5 books are considered the law. And so, as I've told you before, I think the most evident certificate of authorship is where Jesus was having an encounter with the Pharisees, and they were arguing with him about how they believed Moses and they followed the law and all these sorts of things. And he said, if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. And so Jesus right there confirms that Moses wrote the law. God gave him the words to write down. And he wrote some things, of course, that happened before he was born. And then he wrote all the way up to right before he died. So it's thought that Joshua probably wrote the last couple of chapters of Deuteronomy after Moses died. But anyway, Jesus definitely tells us that Moses is the one who penned this. But as we've talked about before, all scripture is breathed out by God. And so he was inspired by God to write exactly what God told him to write down. And there's several places where God would say, write this down. I think about the tablets. But in Deuteronomy 31:9, it says that he was told what to write down and give to the priest. And so we know that he is the author. Now, as I mentioned, this Numbers picks up and talks about their time in the wilderness, and there's many stories of the people's attitudes and things that happened to them, what they witnessed as far as the pillar of fire by night and the cloud by day that guided them where they were supposed to go, and more details about the furnishings for the temple and what the duties of different people were supposed to be, and how things were supposed to go with some of the laws. And so we see that throughout. We see about the Nazirite vow, and you will remember that, or it's mentioned sometime over in Acts and as well as in other places. And so where we find ourselves today, though, in chapter 11, that we are talking about a time that is in the second year of the second of the 40 years that they have been in the wilderness. Now, remember, it was in that first year. So after Moses led the people out and they were out in the wilderness, and then God gave them the 10 Commandments and gave them all the instructions in Exodus as to how they were supposed to build that mobile tabernacle and the furnishings for that and all the things that they were supposed to do. So they'd already been wandering for a year in the wilderness. And so It says here in chapter 10, in the chapter before we find ourselves today, it says in verse 11, "Now it happened in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th of the month, that the cloud was lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony. And the sons of Israel set out on their journeys from the wilderness of Sinai. Then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. So they moved out for the first time according to the command of Yahweh by the hand of Moses. And the standard of the camp of the sons of Judah according to their armies set out first." And then it goes through all the rest of the standards, how God had a way that they were supposed to set out in groups as they followed the cloud. And so we read about that. And then it says in verse 33, "Thus they set out from the mount of Yahweh 3 days' journey with the ark of the covenant of Yahweh journeying in front of them for the 3 days to spy out a resting place for them. Now the cloud of Yahweh was over them by day when they set out from the camp. Then it happened when the ark set out that Moses said, 'Rise up, O Yahweh, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you.' And when it came to rest, he said, 'Return, O Yahweh, to the myriad thousands of Israel.'" And then we pick up in chapter 11 that says, "Now the people became like those who complain of calamity in the ears of Yahweh. And Yahweh heard it, and his anger was kindled, and the fire of Yahweh burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. The people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to Yahweh, and the fire died out." I have to stop right here before we go forward. Just think about it. It had just been a year. They had seen God do mighty things. They had seen God lead them out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm out of Egypt. They had seen God completely wipe out Pharaoh and his army. They had crossed over the Red Sea on dry land with walls of water on both sides of them in safety. God had brought them across. He had made it evident that he was with them and he was leading them based on what he had done in talking to Moses, based on the miracles that they had seen, based on that they could see that big cloud by day and the fire by night. He had given them manna to eat. He had given them water from the rock. He had done so many things. That's not to mention the plagues that they had witnessed before they left Egypt, and how with some of the plagues that they were completely spared, and the Egyptians were affected completely. They had experienced that Passover where they were spared when the angel of death passed over. And I mean, this wasn't a long time later, is my point. It had just been a year, but they've already started complaining. And oh, friends, that makes me look in the mirror and look at my heart and say, do I complain even though God takes such good care of us day after day after day, and we've seen it over and over again? But they were complainers. They were grumblers. It would get them into big trouble, and we need to be aware of that same thing so that we won't crave evil like they did, as we just talked about. But it says in verse 3 of chapter 11, "So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of Yahweh burned among them, and the rabble who were among them had greedy desires. And also the sons of Israel wept again and said, 'Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt.'" Now, they're not thinking about how they were enslaved and how it was terrible for them, but they're thinking about that meat that they wanted, that fish that they wanted, the cucumbers, and I have to laugh at that, and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our appetite is dried up. There is nothing at all to look out except this manna. Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its appearance like that of bdellium. The people would go about and gather it and grind it between 2 millstones, or beat it in the mortar and boil it in the pot and make cakes with it. And its taste was as the taste of cakes baked with oil. And when the dew fell on the camp at night, the manna would fall with it. Now Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, each man at the doorway of his tent, and the anger of Yahweh was kindled greatly, and it was evil in the sight of Moses. So Moses said to Yahweh, "Why have you allowed this evil towards your slave, and why have I not found favor in your sight that you have laid the burden of all this people on me? Was it I who conceived all this people? Was it I who gave birth to them, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing baby to the land which you swore to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give all these people? For they weep before me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. I alone am not able to carry all this people, because it is too heavy for me. So if you're going to deal thus with me, please kill me at once, if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness." Oh my, I just have to pause there. Moses was very stressed out, it sounds like. The people were crying to him and crying out and saying, we don't have anything but this manna. They were missing the fact that God provided everything for them every day, and in taking them, they were just not being thankful for what He had given. And I worry about that I have been guilty of doing that, and may we ask for forgiveness when we do that. But then Moses was very bold in coming to God. Moses was frustrated because God was angry with the people. God was angry at the people that they weren't being thankful. But Moses was like, what do you want me to do? Why'd you bring me out here? And I can't take care of all this. And so we learn an example there that Moses did talk very straight with God, but then God is going to put Moses in his place here in just a minute, as He will with the people, because He does teach us, and we must be very careful, I think, about how we approach God when we're demanding. Now, God was gracious to Moses, and God, of course, knew Moses' heart. He knew that he cared for the people, but we're going to see how God dealt with that coming up. It says, Yahweh therefore said to Moses, gather for me 70 men from the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and their officers, and take them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you. Then I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take of the Spirit who is upon you, and will put him upon them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you will not bear it all alone. Wasn't that gracious of God? That He said, okay, I'm going to put my Holy Spirit on some others so they can help you, Moses. And then He said, and say to the people, and this is our verse, set yourselves apart as holy, for tomorrow you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the ears of Yahweh, saying, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, for it was good for us in Egypt. Therefore Yahweh will give you meat, and you shall eat. And I'm going to read past it. It says, you shall eat, not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected Yahweh, who is among you, and have wept before Him, saying, why did we ever go out from Egypt? God is making it very clear about what He thinks about their complaining here. But Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 on foot, yet you have said I will give them meat so that they may eat for a whole month. This reminds me of what the disciples did to Jesus when they said, where are we going to get food to feed all these people? But it says, should flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to be sufficient for them, or should all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to be sufficient for them? And Yahweh said to Moses, is Yahweh's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word will happen for you or not. Whew! Put Moses right in his place. He said, so Moses went out and told the people the words of Yahweh. Also he gathered 70 men of the elders of the people and had them stand around the tent. And then you could read past that and read that the quail came, and there were so many of them. And then those who rushed to get it suffered from a plague. Because it says down here in verse 32, and the people spent all day and all night and all the next day and gathered the quail. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp, while the meat was still between their teeth before it was chewed. The anger of Yahweh was kindled against the people, and Yahweh struck the people with a very severe plague. So the name of that place was called Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had been greedy. And so this is such an example. God says, I'm going to give you what you ask. But then he disciplined them because of their greed. It had to do with their heart. Now, what I told you at the beginning was it was very interesting to me when I spent time studying here, because I thought, didn't they get quail every day along with their manna? Because all the way back in Exodus, it talks about he gave them meat and he gave them manna each day. And from what I can tell and from what I can read, he did provide meat. We read that all the way back in Exodus. I believe it's in chapter 16 when he first gave the manna. But from what it appears is that may have been, well, these are the only two times that it's recorded that he gave quail. But I don't think that the quail came every day, because if that had been the case, I don't think that they would have complained that they didn't have any meat. Or the other possibility is they did have meat, but they weren't happy with that meat. Although I don't think they would have been greedy for the meat when they saw it at that second year that they were in the wilderness, if they had been receiving it every day. But God he showed them then when he gave them the manna. He had showed them when he'd given them the water from the rock. He showed them that he provided every single day for their needs. And yet they still complained and wanted it to be like it was in the olden days. And so God made it very clear. He both taught Moses a lesson that he would take care of his people, and that he would give a helper for him, and that his arm was not shortened, that he would just do exactly what he said he would do. But he also gave the people at that time what they prayed for, and it was because their hearts were wrong, because they weren't right with him, then they suffered the punishment from that. And several died, it sounds like, because they were greedy for what they had before. They were greedy. They weren't content with what the Lord God had given. And I think we just learned so much for this. In our verse, he says, "You have wept in the ears of Yahweh, saying, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, for it was good for us in Egypt. Therefore, Yahweh will give you meat, and you shall eat." And friends, once they ate, then they were judged. And so we must be very careful. May we just be very careful. May we be thankful. May we be content, because he does provide everything we need. You know, if we hop over to Luke or Matthew, either of those places where Jesus reminded them not to worry, but I'm in Luke right now. It says, when Jesus was talking to them, he said, "For this reason I say to you, do not worry about your life as to what you will eat, nor your body as to what you will put on, for life is more than food, and the body more than clothing." And it goes on to talk about considering the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap, they have no storeroom nor barn, yet God feeds them. How much more valuable are you than the birds? And so he takes care of us. He knows what we need before we ask. May we thank him for what we have, for what he gives us, because everything that we have comes from his hand and is nothing of ourselves. May we not crave evil like they did. May we learn lessons, and may we honor God as holy. Thank him for what he's done. Live that life of thankfulness for his glory. Blessings to you, friends. Until next time.